Aloha and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the sixth session of Adapting to COVID-19, Indonesia, the United States, and the Indo-Pacific virtual forum series, Youth Resilience to Violent Extremism, held with support from the U.S. Embassy Jakarta and in partnership with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Indonesia. And for this session, the Universitas Islam Indonesia. This 9-part virtual series addresses broad, cross-cutting issues that impact both countries: emerging security issues, COVID-19, regional and bilateral trade and investment, and democracy and civil society. It features American and Indonesian experts with diverse yet complementary backgrounds to examine the trajectory of US-Indonesia relations in the new normal. My name is Crystal Pryor, and I'm Vice President at the Pacific Forum. Please note that this session features simultaneous interpretation. You may access the English or Bahasa Indonesia channels using the globe on the bottom right portion of your screen. Our fifth and most recent session, held earlier this month, was on elections in the time of COVID-19. Key findings from that webinar included that COVID-19 complicated the electoral process in both Indonesia and the United States, making it difficult to strike a balance between protecting public health and ensuring all citizens were able to participate in the political process. Many countries, including the US and Indonesia, have rapidly adapted electoral processes in the face of the pandemic, adopting measures that enabled individuals to safely cast their ballots. And in-person voting is a central component of the electoral process, and the elections held in Indonesia and the United States demonstrated that with proper planning, an extensive information campaign, and strict adherence to proper pandemic protocols, elections can be held during health crises. The full key findings and event videos in both English and Indonesian are available on our website at the link appearing in the chat box now. You can also view our key findings from the first, second, third, and fourth sessions in the chat box now. Today's session will focus on youth resilience to violent extremism. This is an opportunity for representatives from the United States, Indonesia, and the wider Indo-Pacific region to share best practices for strengthening youth resilience to extremism and integrating a gender perspective in preventing and countering violent extremism. The webinar will also provide a platform for experts to discuss key challenges involved in the repatriation, rehabilitation, and reintegration of individuals who travel to IS-occupied territories. Crucially, the session will highlight the value of PCVE measures that empower and engage youth at the local level and underscore the importance of implementing the youth, peace, and security agenda. Please note that remarks made in today's program are on the record, and a video-audio recording of the session will be made available on the Pacific Forum website and social media in the future. The event will be live streamed to the CSIS Indonesia YouTube channel as well. Also, a reminder to all of our speakers today, please speak slowly and clearly for the interpreters. I'd now like to introduce Ms. Dina Baker, Political Officer at the Political Section in the U.S. Embassy Jakarta, to give some brief welcome remarks. Ms. Baker?
Thank you, Crystal. Hi, my name is Dina Baker. I work in the political section of the U.S. Embassy Jakarta. I'd like to thank the Pacific Forum International and CSIS Indonesia for their partnership on this important series about adapting to COVID-19. The U.S. Embassy is grateful for your hard work in bringing together this morning's webinar on youth resilience to violent extremism. Violent extremism and youth participation in extremist activities has been a major concern for many countries and regions across the world. Indonesia is no stranger to violent extremism. The recent attack on Cathedral in Makassar and the assault on National Police Headquarters in Jakarta are just two examples. In the United States, we have also seen a rising tide of violent extremism and an increase in youth participation in extremist group, from the bombing at the Boston Marathon to the Capitol riots earlier this year. Throughout the world, we see recruitment being pushed to social media channels. Specific messaging tactics target young people and include using charming recruiters, engaging videos, and entertaining memes to lure tech-savvy Generation Z kids into radical circles. In the world plagued by the pandemic and economic uncertainty, more and more young people are susceptible to recruitment. Recruiters prey on feelings of dissatisfaction with their government's handling of COVID-19, lack of employment opportunities, and the increasing social isolation brought on by social distancing. All this is not intended to make us cower in fear, but instead serve as a reminder that this is a problem that all of us face together, and that the solution to the problem requires global, regional, and bilateral collaboration. The United States, under President Biden, is committed to combating the rise of violent extremism in a comprehensive way, and the US Embassy in Jakarta is proud to partner with the government, local organizations, and leaders on these issues here in Indonesia. We continue to work with moderate religious leaders to amplify voices of peace. We have provided media literacy training to youth to help them recognize and resist online disinformation and radicalization. We have partnered with law enforcement organizations to share best practices in identifying and preventing violent attacks. This morning, our speakers will be discussing many of these issues in further details. It is an honor to welcome Alif Satria, a researcher here at CSIS Indonesia, Rubiyanti Kholifah from AMAN, Indonesia, who will address the gender and regional perspective in CVE, and Colin Clarke of the Soufan Center, who will share the US perspective. I'm also happy to welcome Karina Dewi from Universitas Islam Indonesia as our moderator. Thank you for attending. I encourage you to ask a lot of questions, and we look forward to a robust discussion. Enjoy the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Baker. I'd now like to introduce Mr. Mr. Hanga Fatana, head of the Department of International Relations at the Universitas Islam Indonesia, to welcome you all to the program. Mr. Hanga?
Thank you so much, Dr. Krista Pryor, Vice President of Pacific Forum. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Ms. Dina Baker, Political Officer at the Political Section of United States Embassy in Jakarta. Esteemed speakers, Mr. Alif Satria, Ms. Dwi Rubiyanti Kholifah, and Dr. Colin P. Clarke, and the moderator, Ms. Karina Utami Dewi. My name is Hanga Fatana, Head of Department of International Relations, Universitas Islam Indonesia. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic has prompted each and every state to design a more effective anticipation of and response to new emerging critical global policy agendas of the future. This includes effectively preventing and countering terrorism and violent extremism. In this endeavor, the work Universitas Islam Indonesia does, particularly the Department of International Relations on Indonesia, has become substantial in helping students to frame youth resilience, gender equality, and to promote multiculturalism. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, we had the opportunity to work with many partners to organize interfaith dialogues, discussions, and seminars to broaden our students' knowledge in understanding current global issues. The current pandemic has changed the learning model in all universities, and in the midst of this adjustment, we strive to make lectures and academic services for students remain optimal and to assure that the agenda to nurture our students with multicultural values prevails. This endeavor looks good as we have more students, 100 students, undertaking relevant topics such as religions and international relations and gender studies, through which we also accept students from foreign universities and different universities in Indonesia to study and undertake these topics. On top of all this, youth resilience to violent extremism, as part of the 6th session of virtual forum series adapting to COVID-19, Indonesia, United States, and Indo-Pacific is very timely and relevant to help us educating our students and decreasing the risk of radicalization during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. I know that before COVID-19, my colleague, who is also to be the moderator today, Ms. Karina, was looking closely at how these existing strengths could be leveraged into wider institutional research relationship with our partners in the United States. And I would like to encourage her and her colleagues to continue down that track. I'd like to finish with a few comments on this event. I wish to express my appreciation to all those who work tirelessly to make this event a success. I would like also to thank Pacific Forum and the United States Embassy in Indonesia for providing the opportunity to work together hand in hand in framing youth resilience to violent extremism, both in Indonesia and in the United States. We look forward to working more closely with you in the near future. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hanga. And for those of you just joining us right now, again, I'm your overall MC for this event, Crystal Pryor of the Pacific Forum. We now have a poll question for our audience in advance of our discussion. Here is the question. In your opinion, what is the most common driver of youth radicalization? Socioeconomic marginalization, online misinformation, ideologically inspired extremism, mistrust of government, or discriminatory attitudes towards women. So please pick one answer you think, at least before the presentations today, what you think is the most common driver of youth radicalization. As we're waiting for those results to roll in, I'd like to let you know that Karina Utami Dewi, Deputy Head for International Programs at the Department of International Relations at Universitas Islam Indonesia, will be moderating today's discussion, which will include feedback and question and answers with the audience. Later, participants joining through Zoom will be allowed to unmute their mics to ask questions or give feedback, as well as ask questions in the Q&A box. Participants' cameras are disabled throughout the session. There will also be a post-event survey for our participants to fill out at the end of the event. Now to review the poll results, let me share those with you now. So the most common response was ideologically inspired extremism, followed by socioeconomic marginalization, and then online misinformation, and then quite distant were mistrust of government and discriminatory attitudes towards women. So thank you all for participating. We'll see if you still leave with the same understanding of these drivers at the end of the session. Okay, so for today's session, please note that today's panelists are all speaking in their personal capacities. I will hand over the mic to Ms. Karina Utami Dewi to moderate the discussion and question and answers. So Ms. Karina, if you would.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crystal Pryor, for the opportunity. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Karina, and I am an assistant professor at the Department of International Relations, Universitas Islam Indonesia. Our topic for today is really important, as extremist activity poses a significant threat both to Indonesia and the United States. Although there are significant differences between extremist threats in Indonesia and the US, both nations have faced higher rates of radicalization during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has played into the hands of extremist groups who have capitalized on the current socioeconomic crisis and taken advantage of the increased reliance on social media. Our topic for today is youth resilience to violent extremism, and our guiding themes of discussion will include overview of radicalization and extremism among youth in the US and Indonesia, COVID-19 and youth radicalization, and gender, youth, and extremism. We have with us already three distinguished speakers. We have Mr. Alif Satria, a researcher from the Department of Politics and Social Change, CSIS Indonesia. We also have Ms. Dwi Rubiyanti Kholifah, Indonesia Country Director for AMAN, and also Dr. Colin P. Clarke, Senior Research Fellow, the Soufan Center. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite our first speaker, but before, allow me to introduce Mr. Alif Satria. But before that, I will also would like to remind all the speakers that you have about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll move on to the question and answer session. Please remember to speak slowly and clearly for the interpreters. And for the audience, you also may access the live interpretation feature using the globe icon located in the bottom right portion of your Zoom window. Participants, later on, after all the speakers give their presentation, you will be able to raise your virtual hand, and also you can submit questions in the Q&A box during the presentations. In other words, you don't have to save all the questions until the end of the presentations. And you also have the ability to upvote someone else's question if you want it asked. Now, let's invite our first speaker, Mr. Alif Satria. He is a researcher in the Department of Politics and Social Change of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS Jakarta. And he is also a recent graduate of Georgetown University's Security Studies program. He has focused his education, research, and work on the issues of terrorism, intolerance, and political violence for the past 5 years, conducting various research on radicalization processes, terrorist resilience, and violence in Indonesia. His articles surrounding Indonesia's Jemaah Islamiyah and pro-ISIS terrorist organizations have been published in edited book chapters in popular media such as The Diplomat and New Mandala. He is well-versed in both qualitative and quantitative research methods, along with managing both research design and research dissemination. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me to give a warm welcome to Mr. Satria. Mr. Alif Satria, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, first of all, for that warm introduction. Allow me to share a PowerPoint slide that I'm going to use throughout this presentation today. So first of all, good morning, everyone who's viewing this from Indonesia, and good evening to those who are viewing this from the US. My name is Alif Satria. I am a researcher in the Department of Politics and Social Change in CSIS Jakarta. And today I want to talk about youth and terrorism in Indonesia. Specifically, I want to try and contextualize the risk of Indonesian youth participation in terrorist activities. And to do that, I think as a brief outline of the presentation, I want to talk about three main important questions. One, has Indonesian youth participation in radical activities actually increased? Second, what factors support youth radicalization or drives youth radicalization in Indonesia? And third, what actionable policies can be pursued to minimize radicalization among Indonesian youth? So without further ado, let's go to that first question. Has Indonesian youth participation in radical activities increased? Now, anecdotal accounts suggest that indeed, yes, there has been an increase in youth participation in terrorist attacks. Observers and policymakers often cite these three events. One is the 2016 Samarinda bombing in Kalimantan, which involved a 16-year-old and a 17-year-old. Second is the 2018 Surabaya bombing, which involved a whole family, including 2 girls aged 9 and 11 and 2 boys aged 16 and 18. And more recently, I think this was mentioned earlier in the introduction of this event, was the attack on the National Police Headquarters this year by Zakia Aini, which is a 25-year-old. But I think it's important here to stop at the anecdotal accounts and look at a larger picture based on the data available regarding the spread of arrested terrorists by age. And I think the first thing that I want to point out is that there's actually a lack of publicly available data surrounding this specific kind of information. I think one of the only data to provide a number regarding the percentage of youth involved in terrorist activities is data by the National Counterterrorism Agency. In a study, in a 2012 study involving 110 terrorists, they showed that around 60% of them is considered to be youth, which is below the age of 30. Then again, this is a study in 2012 with a sample size that is relatively small compared to the overall arrested terrorists throughout these past 2 decades. If we try and look to the available public data, we would see that data on actual youth participation in terrorist activities is largely inconclusive. On the graph that you can see on the left here, it shows the spread of arrested terrorists in Indonesia by age in 3 years. One is in 2002. Second is arrested terrorist suspects in 2005. And third is arrested terrorist suspects in 2021. And public data here shows that the percentage of youths involved in terrorist activities, in actual radical activities and behaviors, is actually relatively the same between 2021 and 2002, at least for now. You can see in 2002, around 25% of those who participated in terrorist attacks or who were arrested for terrorist activities were below the age of 30. This is relatively the same in 2021, where around 25% of them are also below 30. If you look closer at the data on a more granular spread of the age, you can actually see that the amount of individuals conducting terrorist activities, or the amount of youth conducting terrorist activities or arrested for radical behaviors actually decreased, especially those below the age of 25. In 2002, this was around 10% of all arrested terrorist suspects. And in 2021, it's only 7.5%. So what this shows, however, is not that youth radicalization is not important. It shows that it's at best inconclusive and more research needs to be put on this. But second, I think it also shows that youth radicalization it's not a new phenomenon. It has occurred since 2002, at least in Indonesia. However, while actual youth participation in radical activities are relatively low and relatively stable, youth support of radical activities is relatively high, and it's a concern that we all should have. A survey by Clarke in 2011 found that around 48.9% of high school students in 5 cities and districts in Java are actually willing to use violence for religion. In 2017, a similar survey by Alfara found that 52.3% of students support violence for religion. Concerningly, around 14.2% of their surveys, of their target of their surveys actually support bombings in the name of religion. So I want to pause here for a bit to show that there's actually a big gap between the amount of youth support towards radical activities and the amount of actual youth participation in radical activities. And I think here it's important to note that support for radical behaviors does not inherently lead to participation in radical behaviors. And I think this is where it is important for all of us to pay attention, that the youth themselves are resilient. I think it was Horgan and Borum that stated that cognitive radicalization does not necessarily correlate with behavioral radicalization. Just because you support a terrorist behavior, for example, doesn't necessarily mean you will actually do them. A more recent study in 2019 by Suyanto, Siri, and Subihartati actually showed that some of these university students who said they were willing to support radical behaviors were what they call pseudo-radicals. These are individuals who partake in radical religious gatherings or who partake or support radical behaviors, but does not actually internalize that ideological identity towards a change in behavior or attitudes. In fact, they actually found that some of these pseudo-radicals in universities actually underwent self-de-radicalization, when the radical ideologies and radical social circles actually clashed with certain personal principles or certain activities that they want to partake in. For example, watching K-pop, let's say. So I think here it is then very important to actually understand who crosses this large gap between supporting radical behaviors to actually participating in radical behaviors. And I think to do that, we need to go to that second question that I asked earlier. What factors actually support youth radicalization in Indonesia? Again, I want to point out here that there has been a lack of studies specifically focusing on how younger terrorist members radicalize. But I think using and taking studies surrounding radicalization in Indonesia, at least there's two things that were commonly found when we interviewed radicalized youth. And I think the first study that's important to look into is a study by actually CSIS and Wahid Foundation that was conducted in 2018. We actually found by interviewing several members of radical religious circles in Bogor and a couple of other cities, we actually found commonly that a common phase that motivates and propels participation in radical behaviors is what we call saturation points. Saturation points is a phase in which an individual faces an identity crisis and therefore lose a sense of belonging to their social network and social communities and lose a sense of meaning for the ideologies and the beliefs that they currently hold. It is this saturation point that then propels them and drives them to seek more radical religious ideologies. And sadly, it is this saturation point that terrorist recruiters use to attract and recruit individuals. This is actually similar to what Quinn Victorowicz argued as a cognitive opening, which is a largely similar phase that he found when he was studying radicalization among radical members in London, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So first is that, a saturation point. The second study that I think is important for us to understand is a study by Huang and Schultz. They interviewed around 106 Indonesians who joined militant groups between the mid-80s until 2014. And they found that in all major entry points into militant groups, social bonds is a significant factor. Now, social bonds is defined as the effective relation between individuals, and in this case, between recruits and a member of that terrorist organizations. They found that social bonds themselves is important to bind these individuals and vet these recruits as they undergo the radicalization process. Interestingly, they also found that social bonds is an important factor even in online radicalization. So even if individuals found or met a terrorist organization through Telegram, for example, social bonds is still important to fully convince them to participate in it, or it's important to ensure that the group trusts this recruit enough to then vet them and involve them in these activities. So those two things, I think, are the common drivers, at least from existing studies. I think here I want to provide two, I think, very poignant quotations from a study by Suyanto, Syria, and Sugihartati that I mentioned earlier, and the study by Huang and Schultz. On the left here is, I think, an interview quote from a student in one of the universities in Indonesia. And here it is shown that this individual realized that they were participating in an extremist group. But the reason why they stayed isn't necessarily because of the ideology per se, but because they will feel bad if they did not attend because they had received some scholarship and other assistance from the individuals they have come to realize as friends. I think on the right, there's a similar issue where Huang and Schultz shown an interview excerpt from a member of the Jemaah Islamiyah. And as shown here, this individual at least partly radicalized simply because their father told them they would like to die as a martyr. Now, I'm not trying to argue here that radical ideologies is not important. I think that it's not the only aspect that matters. I think as shown here, social bonds are important in making sure the individuals are still bound to the group as they undergo and slowly support that radical ideology. So having said that, I think it goes to that last question. What actionable policies can be pursued to minimize radicalization among Indonesian youth? And I want to talk very briefly on three things. One, I think Indonesia should fund and incentivize more public research specifically targeting risk of radicalization among Indonesian youth. And I think this kind of research needs to go beyond survey reports to understand the process of such radicalization, to understand how individuals move from supporting radical behaviors to actually participating in radical behaviors. The second thing is for Indonesia to develop and coordinate very localized youth counter-radicalization programs. And I think here Indonesia needs to pay attention specifically to involve youth and tap into the currently decentralized wealth of experience multiple NGOs have in de-radicalization efforts. But then lastly, I think Indonesia should also start creating off-ramp and disengagement programs in schools and varsities targeting youths who support these radical behaviors. I think it's important here to note that these off-ramp and disengagement programs need to provide some form of alternative activities and social networks, not simply religious messaging and religious counter ideologies that can assist pseudo-radicals to disengage from radical seniors, radical groups, and radical activities. So as a last note, I think the positive thing for this is that most of this is currently already outlined in Indonesia's National Action Plan for Countering Extremism. So that's great. But the concern now is in its implementation, because the devil is always in the implementation. And I think this is what many observers are paying attention to. Indonesia has a great plan moving forward to involve youth, to coordinate between NGOs, to create off-ramps. But the question is, how will that be implemented? And hopefully it's something that we should all pay attention to, and it will all go well. So that's all for me. Thank you so much. I apologize if I go over my time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Satria, for that insightful presentation. Before I move on, I would like to highlight important points in Mr. Satria's talk in contextualizing the risk of Indonesian youth's participation in terrorist activities. As he mentioned, Indonesia needs to focus on doing three things in minimizing radicalization, especially in youth. First, to fund and incentivize more public research that specifically targeting risk of radicalization among Indonesian youth, and also to develop and coordinate localized youth counter-radicalization programs to decrease youth support for radical behaviors, and also to create an off-ramp and disengagement program in schools and varsities targeting youth who support radical behaviors. And of course, as he mentioned, that the concern is always in the implementation. And so before I invite our second panelist, I would like again to remind the participants who joined in the webinar today that you can submit questions in the Q&A box during the presentations. You also have the ability to upvote someone else's question if you want it asked. And later on, after all three panelists finish their presentation, you can also raise your virtual hands to ask the question directly to our panelists. And we also have both interpreter for Indonesian and English. You can choose the audio with the globe icon in your bottom window of Zoom. All right, now we move on to our second panelist, Ms. Dwi Rubiyanti Kholifah. She is Indonesia Country Director for the Asian Muslim Action Network, or AMAN, with a focus on the role of women in peace building and interfaith cooperation. Born and raised in Indonesia, she assists young Muslim scholars conducting research on Muslims responding to modernity and globalization. She is active in writing articles regarding women's issues, minority rights, and the role of women in peace building in journals and online and offline media. She has authored several books, including Contesting Discourse on Sexuality and Sexual Subjectivity Among Single Muslim Women in Pesantren, and co-authored The Future of Feminisms, Confronting Fundamentalism, Conflict, and Neoliberalism. Ms. Kholifah earned a master's degree in health and social science at Mahidol University in Thailand, for which she researched the dynamics of sexual health in the pesantren, or pondok, in Indonesia. She also has a bachelor's degree in literature from University Jember, Indonesia. Ms. Kholifah, you have 10 to 12 minutes for your presentation, and you can pin one of the Zoom tiles called Pacific Forum Timer to keep up with the time. And please speak slowly and clearly for the interpreters. Ms. Kholifah, ladies and gentlemen, please join me to warmly welcome Ms. Kholifah. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mbak Karina. Good morning, everyone. I hope you are in a good health. Let me put my presentation first. Okay, so let me say something about the work on peace building that I've been, going through in 14 years. And then it's suddenly become very timely when the growing of violent extremism happening in many places, including in post-conflict setting. So that actually pushed me to really dig down the knowledge on peace building and looking for some of the tools that possibly to be used in responding the situation. So one is that I would like to share with you today is how we can use peace building in reintegration. I hope that can complete the knowledge of our discussion today, because I am going to bring the story of one of the women that we are working in the field, and particularly in Central Sulawesi and Poso, that she worked closely with the families of ex-terrorists and also try to rebuild the trust to the community. So I hope from that we can find some lesson in answering how we can build resilience to the youth or the children raising by the radical family or the ex-terrorist family. That's another story when we talk about resilience in the big context. So I want to start by sharing the story of Novi. So after a week of field assistant Shahida, a wife of ex-terrorists, sorry if it is too sensitive to call, but I just want to make our audience clear, stepped out from her house to water vegetable in polybags that she received from Novi, the women that I said, field facilitator in helping reintegration. During her visit to some families, she found that mostly women stay inside the house, literally inside the house. Even they don't ever open the door and then stepping outside the house, they just remain inside the house. The belief on women have to stay at home, or the belief on the obedience of husband is obedience to God, were strongly held by them. She started the activity of planting chili and vegetable in polybags. She referred to Novi. So Novi invited local mothers and wife of the ex. Only few came out and joined the activity. The rest resisted and remained staying inside the house. When the vegetables are growing, Novi distributed to all families of the ex, in particular who are resisted to the program, and put at the veranda and asked them to take care, giving water and fertilizer to the pot. And then surprisingly, the many wife finally opened herself and then step out from the house and take care of vegetable. Novi continue to initiate ginger project by inviting all local women and the wives to Molimbu, is the traditional party for eating together in the village, and discuss the program. Both groups are helping each other in planting process of planting ginger, but at the same time also producing some product related with the ginger. And Novi engaged all children in a literacy program while she actually assisting the wife. The idea is to create exchange room for those children, not only the children exclusively to family of the ex-terrorists, but the children from the village itself need to be also treated. And during drawing activity, boys of the ex-family mostly draw gun, and then girls mostly draw hijab or mother activity. They mostly want to be like their parents. With the local leader, on the other hand, with the local leader, Novi also initiated the farmer group and appointed the newcomer, the ex, as the leader. And the newcomer mostly now choosing raising chickens, and that keep them busy all the time. In 3 years of the working in the field, the interaction are growing among mothers in Ginger Project, both group. Literacy program has more singing, dancing, and outdoor activities, and more newcomers raising chickens to prevent them from re-engagement with the old group or the radical group. So what we can actually learn from the story, I would like to start is the relevance of peace building. I want to share the values and the principles that Novi actually share to the entire of the community. The belief that the women is a narrative of life, close to the narrative of life. The woman has, capability genuinely play as or acting as mother or as father is really flexible. So therefore, she really want to teach the wife to be more independent instead of waiting all the time for the husband. The other value that very important is respecting diversities, because the family of the ex-terrorists mostly believe on the homogeneous group. Exposing to diversity is almost impossible, but when they return to the village for reintegration, they have to open themselves to embrace different people in the community. Other principle that are very important from the work is actually long-term work of transforming the relationship and social dynamic that cause violence into constructive cooperation. So there are a lot of moments that actually created by the field facilitator to create a potential role for the newcomer, the ex, to be engaged with the community. Aside that, there are a lot of spaces that actually creating for increasing the interaction by providing that kind of media, so that very possible different groups can actually engage and have more deeply cooperation. And we also see that supporting local community are very important, and the local leader, of course, is very important. What I would like to say here is, in many cases, the reintegration process is a short project, like 6 months, while bringing people and opening their mind or even changing their perspective is taking long time. And with that, the rest of that, actually many civil society doing by heart without sufficient support from the government or even the donor, because donor actually now is not allowing the money goes to the the families of ex-terrorists. When we talk about gender, I should say, and I would like you to remember that gender we need to put as intersectional perspective. In the rest of 14 years of my work in 40 communities in 7 provinces in Indonesia, we're realizing that gender often treated as the role of women. But when we are able to use gender as intersectional perspective, we are able to really looking at the intersectional factors and actors to actually helping in promoting gender equality. So working in this case, there's 2 frameworks that actually applying in the world: women, peace, and security, number 1, and the youth, peace, and security. And 2 of the framework are actually communicating each other. For us, working in this field, we see that intersection of women, peace, and security and youth, peace, and security is on the young women. And when you see the story of Novi, you will see that how Novi is starting exposing the girls from the family of the ex to understand the diversity that she's now living in the community, and teaching them with the critical thinking, introduced with the plural habitus, helping them challenge gender rigidity from the parents, and facilitate them to embrace the new idea that women actually can do more than just staying at home or laying down on the bed like their mother. So other thing that I would like to highlight on gender as the intersectional perspective is we often actually see in our work that dealing with the violent extremism, the gender, the rigid gender construction often put as the prior for narrative that they are using in social media. On the other hand, but that's not the, it's not fixed like that. There are also other good narrative or seem more liberating narrative that used by the group that actually to target a particular group and specifically when they are facing the group who seems like more empowered, like women group, for example. Then you will see some women group in Indonesia able to transform the leader, the violent extremist group actually able to recruit the leader of the women group, and that actually changed the entire of the organization. But how they do it, they actually doing more using liberating a narrative. When Novi actually facing that how the wives of the ex internalizing the gender rigidity, and Novi would need to counter that idea by showing the diverse women realities in the village, that they need to defend the life. Life is so beautiful. Life is a diverse. Women can do anything that they want, and then women also can contribute positively to the social. And also, this is the time for also Novi to correct the misunderstanding regarding with the prejudice that been staying in the wives among the wife, that the community wouldn't able to actually reach them, and they don't want to actually interact with them. In totally wrong. The community are actually willing to welcome them and engage back to the social activity. Other thing that I would like to highlight when we talk about the gender as intersectional perspective is women play a key role in fostering community resilience and in influence worldviews and attitude among young people. It's very true.
I'm so sorry that your time is up. Maybe you
can I have 2 minutes? Yeah, can I have?
Yes, sure. Very
quickly. Just to wrap up.
Yes.
Yeah, when you see the growing of the changings among wives, and then you will see that the children also are very curious to change, to engage with some new dynamic in the village, and then the husband also have another activity. So the entire of the family actually have their own busy time. Then they can actually actualize themselves, but at the same time also they can contribute to the community. To end my presentation, I would like to share some of the sources of resistance to radicalism that actually I brought from the study, several study done in Indonesia, as well as our experience as practitioners, looking at the importance of the genuinity of the women as peace builder, very crucial. And number two is the plural habitus need to be actually introduced, the different reference, the knowledge, friends' practices in understanding religion, so that people actually can see how diverse they are. And the warm and close relationship inside family and also friendship. And the rest, the last is actually, the more we create spaces for exposure, diversities and differences in our society, the more opportunity to actually bring somebody to disengage from the radical group. Of course, this need to be very long process, but I do believe that the role of the family are very much determine how to create youth to be resilient. So when we talk about youth, remember that youth are part of the family, and the center of the family is the mother. So then we need to really bring this intersection into together in order to see how our future youth become stronger and also resilient. Not only youth in the normal family, but also youth in the family where they ever experienced radicalism before. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Ms. Kholifah. And before I move on, I would like to also highlight important points in Ms. Kholifah's presentation. She mentioned that source of resistance to radicalism is women who are close to a narrative of life, love, and caring, and also nonviolence. And there's also critical thinking is also important to learn diverse knowledge and different trends and practices in understanding religions. Warm and close relationship with family and friends are also necessary, and also new spaces to expose differences so it can allow alternative information, and then it could help in resistance to radicalization. Now, I would like to once again to remind all the participants that you can submit questions in the Q&A box during the presentations. You can also upvote question that you want to be asked later. You can also later to raise your virtual hand and then ask the questions to the panelists directly. It will also help to mention who you want to address your questions to, and also please state your name and affiliation if it is possible. All right, now last but not least, let's invite our third panelist, Dr. Colin P. Clarke. He is a senior research fellow at the Soufan Center. He is the director of policy and research, where his research focuses on domestic and transnational terrorism, international security, and geopolitics. Prior to joining the Soufan Group, Dr. Clarke was a professor at Carnegie Mellon University and a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation, where he spent a decade researching terrorism, insurgency, and criminal networks. At RAND, Dr. Clarke led studies on ISIS financing, the future of terrorism and transnational crime, and lessons learned from all insurgencies since the end of the World War II. Dr. Clarke is also an associate fellow at the International Center for Counterterrorism, The Hague, a non-resident senior fellow in the program on national security at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, an associate fellow at the Global Network on Extremism and Technology, and a member of the network of experts at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Dr. Clarke has a PhD in International Security Policy from the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. Now, Dr. Clarke, again, you have 10 to 12 minutes for your presentation, and you can pin the Zoom tile Pacific Forum timer to keep up with the time. And also please speak slowly and clearly for the interpreter. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Dr. Clarke. Dr. Clarke, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you to my gracious hosts at the Pacific Forum for inviting me to speak this evening on youth resilience to violent extremism. I'm going to cover two different topics. I'm going to speak to domestic extremism in the United States, and I'll touch upon briefly some of the findings from our Soufan Center report on terrorism and counterterrorism in Southeast Asia, emerging trends and dynamics. And I pasted a link to that paper in the chat for anyone to read. To open with, what does the scene in the US look like for domestic extremism? I think January 6th was a watershed event in the US. We had hundreds of people take part in a violent insurrection that was designed to reverse the results of a free and fair election and usurp American democracy. This was encouraged, no less, by the outgoing president of the country, Donald Trump. His rhetoric went a long way toward energizing domestic extremism in the United States. The terrorism landscape in the US is more diverse than at any time in the last 2 decades. Just looking at the far right alone, there are white supremacists, neo-Nazis, anti-government militias, like the Three Percenters and the Oath Keepers. There are chauvinist groups like the Proud Boys, QAnon conspiracy theorists, and violent misogynists known as incels or involuntary celibates. There are also a range of actors from across the ideological spectrum, including on the left, such as Antifa and radical anarchists. And really, one of the primary drivers of unrest in the United States right now, in my opinion, is the lack of trust and authority in the government, in US institutions, in the media, and really all across the spectrum. I'll speak briefly now to some of the findings, the main findings from our Soufan Center report on terrorism and counterterrorism in Southeast Asia. And I'll speak specifically to the role of women. Gender stereotyping often leads to female, particularly suicide bombers, receiving disproportionately more media attention than male attackers. We found that by one count, terrorist groups have received 8 times as many stories in the media when they used females as when they used male bombers. The contagion effect, which is also known as the tendency of well-publicized acts of violence to trigger follow-on or copycat attacks, suggests more female attackers can thus be expected in Southeast Asia. This is particularly true if they're eulogized as martyrs, and there's no concerted pushback by Islamic leaders in conservative societies. The growing body of research on women engaged in terrorism and violent extremism in the Middle East, in South Asia, and Southeast Asia, and elsewhere suggests that many females are motivated by the same exact drivers as their male counterparts and play multiple, sometimes overlapping, roles of perpetrator, victim, ideologue, enabler, or attacker. And yet, there's often a tendency, as has been seen in commentary on recent attacks in Indonesia, to deny the possibility of women being motivated to perpetrate these attacks for reasons of their own, even as structural gender inequalities have been known to make participation in terrorist groups appealing. If I have time toward the end, I can come back and revisit some more of our findings from that paper. I'll speak a little bit now to the very thorny and controversial issue of repatriating foreign terrorist fighters from the Caliphate in Iraq and Syria. At the Soufan Center, we've been outspoken on the issue of repatriation. We believe that the current hands-off stance pursued by European and other Western governments, to include many US allies, will only create greater danger in the future. Just looking at the squalor and the filth of the camps, the inhumane living conditions, and the lack of just treatment, especially for children, this all fuels the Salafi jihadist narrative of grievance and revenge that has proven so potent in recruiting followers for groups like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda before it. Many of the women are victims of physical and emotional abuse, but some are also deeply radicalized, preaching toxic ISIS propaganda to the increasingly desperate detainees of Al-Hol. Detained children growing up in brutal conditions and subjected to persistent indoctrination are at particular risk of becoming radicalized and pursuing a path of terrorism. One point I'd like to highlight here, because I think this is among the most important findings that we've come across in the issue of repatriation. And this is something that I've spoken to, governments, intelligence agencies, policymakers, and military officials abroad about, is this concept of revoking an individual's citizenship, in effect making them a stateless person. The denial of citizenship by home nations will only bolster these individuals' sense of being, in effect, citizens of the Islamic State. If they're not citizens of any country, they have no choice but to be a citizen of the Islamic State. And this potentially prepares them to form the core of a future resurgence. So we spend so much time, energy, resources fighting against the Islamic State, blood and treasure spilled over the course of years. And now, right at the very end of the process of the conflict, Western nations say, well, I'm taking a hands-off approach. And there are a number of reasons for that, and I can speak to those in question and answer. I think at the very top, it's repatriation is viewed by politicians specifically as a very risky endeavor. You have to think about politicians are operating on short-term electoral cycles, right? If they can't show results in that short 4-year period, when the issues that we're talking about and the grievances require a generational commitment, really, of resources, of development, of education. And that's not something a lot of politicians want to stake their name on, which is unfortunate. It's very myopic, in my opinion. It's very short-sighted. And it's going to lead us back to the same place where we've been for the past 20 years in the so-called global war on terrorism. It's really somewhat of a hamster wheel of just the same things over and over. And yet, when I go to Brussels or I show up at international conferences in London, everybody shrugs and says, what can we do? Well, the answer is clear. It's just about having the will, the political will and the courage to do it. That's what's lacking, in my opinion. The choice is clear. Pay a relatively small price now or pay a huge price later. Again and again, we have seen what happens when the West insufficiently reacts to the warning signs of terrorism. We saw it on September 11, 2001. We saw it on the Madrid commuter rail system, 2004. We saw it at the Bataclan Theater in Paris, at the Manchester Arena, at the Brussels airport, and in other cities across the Western world and throughout the Middle East, North Africa, South, Central, and Southeast Asia. Breaking the cycle of violence will not be easy, but it's better than sleepwalking back into the mistakes of the past. And we've long urged Western governments and policymakers to expedite the process of repatriation, to put in place reintegration and rehabilitation programs, and to seriously prioritize this issue because it's a counterterrorism issue and it's a humanitarian issue, and it's one that's being overlooked. Lastly, I'll talk a little bit about how the US domestic terrorism scene may be impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think there are a few things at play here with US domestic terrorism, which is evolving. It's a very dynamic and fluid situation at the moment. I think 2020 was similar to the insurrection on January 6th. It was a watershed year, 2020, for recruitment for domestic terrorism groups. You know, as the father of 2 young kids, I know how difficult it was to be a working parent trying to manage kids who weren't in school, that needed to be taught. And what we saw across the country was older kids. I mean, my children are quite young, 3 and 5 years old, but older kids, 10, 12, teenagers, they were, because they're perceived as being self-sufficient and able to take care of themselves, they were left to their own devices. And when I say devices, in many cases, I mean this literally. Their phones, right? Their iPads, their computers, where many were playing video games, and some knowingly and others unknowingly imbibing vast amounts of terrorist propaganda. And I think it's very difficult to understand the impact of that. We likely won't see the effects of that until years in the future. There's a lag effect often, I think, between events and action, unfortunately. And the US is wholly unprepared to deal with that. has not thought much about the threat. And in the United States, we have a complete double standard when it comes to terrorism. If someone is a Muslim, it is, it's deemed a major emergency. But when it's a white person engaged in a shooting, the reaction is often to talk about mental health or a number of other issues. And there's a real reluctance to use the phrase terrorism when it's the same exact action. It's politically and ideologically motivated violence. It's no different. Once travel bans are dropped and restrictions are lifted, we're likely going to see more extremists traveling to meet up with one another, to vet each other, to forge bonds, and to network. And Ms. Dina Baker made some of these points in her opening remarks. And lastly, and this is something that concerns me very much, as we open back up, we're likely to see a plethora of so-called soft targets present themselves, with people returning to normal activities like ball games, like concerts, farmers markets, street carnivals, etc. So all those people that have been cooped up inside their house for the last year and a half, imbibing disinformation and terrorist propaganda, some dealing with some very genuine mental health struggles. And in the United States, a country where people, I say, the line I've been using is they're angry, they're anxious, and they're well armed. And that's a toxic and quite a lethal combination. Thank you for the opportunity to offer remarks today, and I look forward to engaging in question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Colin Clarke. There are several points that are very important that has been highlighted by Dr. Colin Clarke. One of the points is that what is currently lacking from the leaders of the world is the political will to fight and counter violence extremism, and that we need to understand that whether we pay the relatively small price now or pay a huge price later, and especially understanding that it is humanitarian issues and a counterterrorism issue. Okay, so we already have several questions here, but before I read the question and Q&A box, since we have a very limited time, maybe if there's any participant wants to ask question directly to the panelist, you can raise hand now, and then the host will unmute and ask you to turn on your camera. Is there any question from the participants to directly to the panelist? I guess not. All right, if there's no participants that want to ask the question through raise hand feature, I would move on directly to the Q&A box. So we have about 12 questions already here, both in Indonesian and English. First, I would like to invite, so this question is for Mr. Alif Satria. It's coming from YouTube. So with the declining number of youth participating in violent extremism in Indonesia, does this mean that the government has been successful in its intervention? Mr. Satria, what do you think?
Thank you so much. I'll try to answer this as quick as I can to get more questions in. But I think that truly depends on what numbers you are using to measure the metric of success, right? Because if you look into the participation of youth in actual terrorist and radical activities, we see that it's relatively stable, it's relatively low. So on that front, it could be seen as a success. Although, to be quite fair, I think there's still more research that needs to be done to actually validate these numbers. A longitudinal study is still needed. But I think if you look at the numbers of support in use for radical behaviors, I think it is in here where government is still not yet as successful. Because as you can see, the numbers is relatively high, and it has continued to be around 40 to 50% in the past 5 years. And that's, I think, is a concern that we all should have. So I think to your end, to your question, yes, no, it depends on the metric that you use for measuring success. But I think largely the government has more to do in terms of reducing and minimizing the support from Indonesian youth towards radical behaviors and ideologies. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Alif Satria. So I would like to address the next question since we have very limited time. I see a few questions already about it. I think next is from Nanda Fajar Aditya. I think I would like to address this question to Ms. Kholifah. What are the strategies to de-radicalize or disengage youth or children if their parents who provide livelihood still have extreme views? That's really interesting. Ms. Kholifah? Yes.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, this is a difficult question. Therefore, why we cannot separate the intervention to youth and the parents. It should go together. But for the moment, some of people, in particular the Ministry of the Social Affairs, really looking at that element as the a condition to bring the children or the youth back to the home. One is the condition is having the parents is already clean, but if the parents still have a strong influence to the extremist ideology, they rather finding a different approach. Recently, the working group on women and PCVE in collaboration with Fatayat Nahdlatul Ulama, the wing organization of the Nahdlatul Ulama in Indonesia, discussing about the potential of the Islamic boarding school as a home for reintegration, de-radicalization, rehabilitation, and reintegration for the children. I think in that discussion, we found that why the Islamic boarding school are more ready, because they are not just a single entity. They are actually the ecosystem. They are in the community. In particular, they have a specific treatment on how to rehabilitation, but at the same time, they also have a supportive community that can, provide positive medium for the children to go through in the process of, understanding more diverse people, and including learning more progressive interpretation of the religious text, but at the same time also finding adopted, parents to always be ready in helping them if they need some help. So with that proposal, I feel that the Islamic boarding school is much more, ready comparing to putting the children only in isolated situation or in even rehabilitation center because they're more healthy for them. But of course, need to get the political support, yes. And also not only just the moral support, but I think financially support is also need to be there if we would like to actually expand the role of the Islamic boarding school, including in tackling or helping rehabilitation and reintegration in the future.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Kholifah, for that answer. And I see that one of the attendees is raising hand, Mr. Tom Connolly. We would like to invite you to deliver your question directly to the panelists, please. Go ahead.
Fantastic. Thank you. Firstly, I'd like to thank all of the speakers for your presentations. They've been really interesting. My question is directed towards both Colin, Clarke, and any of our Indonesian counterparts. I find these sessions are particularly useful in drawing out any sort of actionable recommendations or sort of an exchange of best practices between individuals, governments, civil society groups. I'd like to ask Colin Clarke firstly what he thinks sort of the two most important takeaways are from the Biden administration's national action plan for countering domestic terrorism. There's going to be both what you think should be included that isn't, or what is included and it is really well targeted. And I'd like to extend the same question to our Indonesian counterparts in relation to the national action plan on countering violent extremism. Because I figure if we can draw out, one or two recommendations of what we think is really well targeted and works really well, these sessions can really shine. Thank you.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Dr. Clarke. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. No, it's a great question. I wrote a commentary on War on the Rocks with my colleague, Molly Saltskog from the Soufan Center, where we kind of assessed the Biden administration strategy. And we gave credit where credit was due, and we were also critical in areas we thought where the administration fell short. In full transparency, I'm rooting for the administration. I want them to do well. I want them to figure it out. It was, a pretty up and down last 4 years under Trump. Things were quite erratic. I'm always rooting for the United States to do well. I want whoever's leading the country to have a vision that will lead our country. But we're struggling right now. We've got some real issues on the home front. I'll speak to two things in particular, and one is maybe not as apparent when you read the strategy if you're not from the United States. And to me, what I read in between the lines there is that a lot of what we're leading up to is probably some kind of, quorum or some kind of hearing on, does the United States need a law specifically for domestic terrorist groups? We don't have that at current. So we can designate foreign terrorist organizations, and we have, but we have no similar equivalent for domestic terrorist groups in the United States. Now, there are real concerns with that. There's a slippery slope, and there are real concerns for abuse. If you go back to the Trump administration, on multiple occasions, he threatened to designate Antifa, right? Which was really a politically motivated move, because if you look at the data, the overwhelming threat comes from the far right. But it was popular among Trump's support base to say, I'm going to designate Antifa, even though we don't even have domestic terrorism statute. But a lot of the folks that I talk to in federal law enforcement say we need one to afford the FBI and other agencies with the tools and the resources they need to combat this threat. And there is a significant threat. The question is, how do we do that while protecting civil liberties? We saw that with the global war on terrorism. We saw Muslim communities in the United States unfairly targeted, harassed, intimidated, and mistreated. How do you avoid, right? So to me, we're coming up on this inflection point 20 years after the 9/11 attacks. How do we learn from what we've done? How do we keep the good and discard the bad? Because we made a lot of mistakes over these last 2 decades. How do we shed that, jettison that, but keep the important stuff like cooperation with our international partners, right? Intelligence sharing and analysis. The other piece that I think, we're all very stumped on is, how do you deal with these militias? Because in the United States, you can own as many guns as you'd like, very high caliber, sophisticated weaponry, and you could stockpile ammunition for days and weeks and months, and that's not illegal. And you can say some really bad things about the government, and that's not illegal. That's the First and Second Amendment for you. How do you then predict who's going to cross the line, where you have a situation where we've got, domestic terrorism happening on our soil in our homeland? We've seen it before. We've seen this movie before with the Oklahoma City bombing and other events. Look, I'm talking to you today from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I lived down the street from the Tree of Life Synagogue when that synagogue was attacked. I was in my house that same day writing about Somalia and Yemen and all the things that happened out there. This is terrorism happening down the street from where I live. So we've got a reckoning in the United States that we've got to deal with. It goes back to what I spoke to earlier, which is a lack of political will, which is crippling our political system right now. Every issue is looked at through a partisan lens, and that's unfortunate because we get very little accomplished. And so I'm rooting for the Biden administration. It's a Herculean task, and I think there are some real opportunities, but I think there are some real challenges as well. And I'll be there potentially even on Capitol Hill testifying if I'm asked to. about, my opinion and looking at some of our research, some of our data, some of our empirical evidence that should be informing the analysis that drives the response to the threat. Sorry, I apologize if that was long-winded. I'm a recovering college professor, so I still have that tendency.
Yeah. So is there is Mr. Alif Satria or Ms. Kholifah would like to also maybe address the same question, but in relation to Indonesia's plan on countering violent extremism? Maybe Mr. Satria, yes.
Sure. I'd like to address like three things really quickly. What I think is good from the plan, what I think is still needs to be of work from the plan, and what I think is controversial and needs to be paid attention to from the plan. One, the good thing I think about the Indonesia's national action plan to preventing extremism is the fact that they involve a lot of local and grassroots actors. They are at least planning to involve more people in designing counter-radicalization aspects and de-radicalization programs, including local NGOs, local governments, and like prison guards and all individuals who should have been involved from the beginning. So that I think is great. A controversial thing I think from the National Action Plan is the reintroduction of what the plan calls community policing, and this has a very not necessarily. Yeah, it has a very controversial history, especially in Indonesia, referring back to community policing in the era of Suharto. But again, I think this is important to pay attention to. I do agree, and I understand that in some other countries, such as London and England, for example, in the UK, community policing has actually helped in some ways to prevent radicalization and create an early warning system to provide off-ramps to potential radicalized youth. But I think the last thing that I think still needs to be worked on from the National Action Plan is I think it still focuses very heavily on providing religious counter-radicalization. And I think we need to start to broaden and understand the fact that a radicalization process is not just about the ideology. It's also about the process of understanding and internalizing the ideology. And that involves a lot of things, such as social bonds, as I said earlier, was important. It's about preventing the individuals from getting to a saturation point by providing them meaningful activities, for example. So I think this is something that the National Action Plan can still expand towards, non-religious disengagement and a counter-radicalization efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Alif. Yes.
Can I add a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah. Two things that I would like to highlight on our national action plan. Number one is, aside what Ali mentioned already, I think that is the proven that civic space in Indonesia is still workable. Our commitment to democracy and good governance should reflect to the way how government open the civic space. And the National Action Plan has those elements wider comparing to other regulation product related with violent extremism or terrorism in Indonesia. So that is important for bringing or mobilizing the all actors from non-traditional security sector to really active engage in the process of planning, implementation, and also the monitoring and evaluation. As civil society, they're working closely now with the local government in localizing national action plan. What we learn is actually this is the time that the local government feel that they are going to have authority to actually handle some of the parts in intervention relating with PCVE in Indonesia. And there's a good news. And the other is I would like to highlight on the existence of gender mainstreaming and the child protection as the principle, and also reflecting into the program. And I think with the model of joint secretariat, there's actually allowing government and non-government potentially interact in the process, but we are still waiting whether the Joint Secretariat is going to be open for civil society engaged directly into the heart of the Joint Secretariat, not as the constituent to be consulted. So we are just waiting right now. But civil society not silent. We are in the very active mood to advocate currently at the national level, ensuring that our proposal later on relating with the specific regulation on gender mainstreaming in PCVE be adopted by BNPT, but at the same time also we strengthening gender mainstreaming into the local regulation, because we want to see gender mainstreaming not just as a principle, but is really reflecting into the whole article on the regulation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ms. Kholifah. I think we have very limited time, but I think we have one more, a little bit of time to answer one more question. So I think I'm going to address this to all of our panelists, and then you can like include it as part of the closing statement for the webinar as well. So the next question, the last question is going to be from Nur Kholifah. And she asks how to invite the youth to always be enthusiastic about preventing extremism issue by participating in activities and be consistent on it. So maybe Mr. Alif first, and then I'll go to Ms. Kholifah and then Dr. Clarke. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. And this is a great question. Let this also be my closing remarks for this. I think what's important to motivate the youth to participate is, one, actually providing a platform where they are able to join. I think this is a change that the Indonesian government is actually moving towards. They are opening up room for youth to participate in local disengagement and counter-radicalization efforts. But I think more than that is to also not only focus counter-radicalization and disengagement efforts in terms of religion and religious counter ideologies, right? Because I think the most important thing to understand about radicalization, at least in Indonesia among the youth, is that it is so much about that saturation point. It is so much about that social bond. And I think in order to counter that, it's also very important to provide alternative activities that are meaningful towards youth themselves. And this doesn't have to be in the form of religious gatherings or moderate religious teachings. It could be something in the, it could be, as studies show, in the form of, for example, K-pop, right? Things that individuals and youth will actually find meaning in. And I think this, should be expanded to more than just talking about religion. So I think that's my answer to that, and hopefully my ending remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Alif. Ms. Kholifah, and also with your closing remarks, please.
Okay. Number one, I think I believe that by providing a plural habitus for everyone, youth in particularly, introducing them with the different reference, different school of thoughts, and different ideas, different expression of the religion, and different exposure to the different community, that actually create, I call it a space of doubt. Doubting to particularly ideology is a good one, meaning that you have a space for embracing other, or at least you have a space to curiously read other, teaching, or if it is not other reference, so that actually bring you into certain of a process inside yourself until you actually able to decide which one is more workable in the current context. So I'm just closing by saying that gender perspective is very important when we discuss about violent extremism. We know that the recruitment way, or the narrative of the recruitment for men, women, and also for the youth are actually diverse. And also the motivation are diverse. The role of the women and men inside the violent extremist group are also diverse. And the gender pathway are very much visible when you're looking at the specific element of women is in the entrance to radicalization is on the arranged marriage for some of them, yeah, because it's not single factor. But the other is the a new hope that they're expecting to liberate them into better situation. Also, it is myth, but it has a big value among the women. And with that, actually, I also would like to highlight the importance to see that specific experience on gender injustice and inequality that actually can help us to understand better why men and women actually engage, that can help us to really tracking down the gender pathway, including helping us to identifying the possible, the potential resources of the resistance. So that gender perspective is very, very important.
Right. All right. Thank you, Ms. Kholifah. Lastly, I know we are running out of time, but Dr. Colin Clarke, really short. Oh, your closely marked as well.
Sure. No, I would just say it's important to show youth the consequences of extremism and radicalization, and to dispel the romantic notion that many had before they went and traveled to the Caliphate, because for most people, it wasn't what they expected. And it was a very rude awakening, and they found out the hard way, and their lives are, now lost or ruined. So I think there's got to be a hard side to this too. It's not all rainbows and unicorns, right? And putting together programs for people to play chess and, drink juice together. There's a really dark side to violent extremism. And unless we let people know that, there's going to continue to be this romantic vision of revolutionaries that people have had since the beginning of time. So I would just, add that to the current dialogue.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Clarke. Thank you so much, all the panelists. Unfortunately, our time is very limited, so we cannot answer all the questions delivered. And I think with that, I would like to summarize that political will and also prioritizing by the government is very important in preventing and countering the violent extremism in youth. All right, so that's it for my session today. I would like to return the forum back to Dr. Crystal Pryor. Dr. Crystal Pryor, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Karina, for your excellent moderation of today's panel. And thank you also to our esteemed panelists and participants for joining us today. We were unable to answer all of the great questions that you all sent in, but we do hope this is just part of an ongoing dialogue between Indonesia, the US, and the region as a whole on youth resilience to violent extremism. We hope you'll continue staying engaged with Pacific Forum programming, which you can find out more about on our website, www.pacforum.org. The 7th session in this series is slated for exactly 3 weeks from today, August 23rd in the United States and the 24th in Asia. The topic will be related to gender and women's empowerment. Please subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on social media for updates on these sessions. I'd also like to remind you of the bilingual post-event survey, which we'll share in the chat box now. We would really appreciate if you would just take a few minutes to complete it and share with us your feedback. Thank you again to our speakers for joining us today, to our partners CSIS and UII, and especially Ms. Dwi, as well as to the US Embassy Jakarta for making this event possible. We hope that we'll see you for the last 3 events in this series. Thanks and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.